Okay, I'm Robert Schock, and I'm a full-time faculty member at Boston University. I am in the Division of Natural Sciences in the College of General Studies, where I've been since 1984. And I am a geologist. My PhD is in geology and geophysicist. And I'm known in some circles as the person who's responsible for developing scientific evidence for the redating of the Great Sphinx. That the traditional view before I started working on it was that the Sphinx, the Great Sphinx of Giza, just on the same plateau as the Great Pyramid, that the Great Sphinx dates to approximately 2500 BC. And my research that I've developed over the last 15 plus years indicates in my analysis that the core body of the Sphinx goes back much earlier. By my dating, I believe it goes back to approximately 5000 BC or earlier. I usually say 5 to 7000 BC. The point is, that's just the core body, number one. Make a couple of points. The head has been recarved, it's been refurbished many times over the millennia and was certainly used by the Old Kingdom Egyptians, but I believe not built by them from scratch, that they were reusing, refurbishing, recarving, in particular recarving the head much later in time, about 2500 BC, but the core body goes back at least 2,000–3,000 years earlier. Okay, I'm just saying the stage, I guess. Okay, my work on redating the Sphinx has had a mixed reaction, should I say. My work on redating the Sphinx has had a mixed reaction depending on the audience. And what I found is that when I talk to my fellow geologists, for instance, at Geological Society of America meetings, no one has any problem with it. None of my fellow geologists disagree with me. In fact, I've had friends of mine who are PhD geologists, professionals, say it's all very clear cut to them, all makes a lot of sense to them. I'm just applying standard geological techniques, but I happen to be applying them to a very famous structure, the Great Sphinx. The problem is that my conclusions are very radical according to some archaeologists and Egyptologists, because I'm pushing the date of the Sphinx back into pre-dynastic times, which for them, and I agree with this, for them it has all kinds of implications if it's true that things were more civilized, more advanced at earlier point in time than they believed up until now. So there are a lot of implications, and their initial reaction, I find, is to simply deny my evidence, deny my data, and deny my conclusions, and keep their tidy story. So the geologists, my colleagues among the geological community, have accepted my work, and I found no problems with them on the whole. Archaeologists and Egyptologists, on the other hand, have had a very adverse reaction to the point of just saying that I'm absolutely wrong, denying the evidence, denying the data. And I would add that there is a small group of geoarchaeologists who really are in the, and I hate to use the term in science, but in the camp of the Egyptologists who follow the Egyptological line. And in fact, among themselves, have come up with all kinds of hypotheses and theories which are contradictory to one another. They don't even agree among themselves, but all kinds of hypotheses and theories to discount my evidence, my data, and try to explain it away, which I've analyzed these, other geologists have analyzed these counter-arguments, and they really just don't account for the data. And I think we have come to a point where we have to simply accept, based on the evidence we now have, that the origins of the Great Sphinx go back into pre-dynastic times, go back at least, by my estimate, 2,000 plus years earlier than the traditional view. I've also received, my work on the Great Sphinx in particular, I've also had lots of reactions from, should we call it, the public. And there's a group out there that reacts to my work on the Great Sphinx by saying that I'm not making it old enough. They look at my data, they want to interpret as saying the Sphinx is even older. So there's a large contingent of what we might call alternative researchers in Egyptology and ancient history who want to take my data, which I say suggests that the Sphinx is older, but only a few thousand years older, and they want to sort of extrapolate from that and make it 10,000 BC, some of them even as much as 30,000 plus BC, and really extend it into the distant past. So, and I just don't see that their arguments make sense to me. I mean, that's not the way I would interpret my own data. So I sometimes feel that I am caught in the middle between the classical Egyptologists and archaeologists on the one hand, who say the Sphinx is 2500 BC, end of story, and then this alternative camp, which wants to make it generally at least 10,000 BC, or even much older. And here I am in the middle, just trying to look at the evidence I have, interpret it to the best of my ability, and I'm coming up, I sometimes feel, with a date and a chronology that doesn't please anyone. Neither, I can't please the classical scholars and the traditional academics, and I can't please the, quote, alternative researchers. What I found is the core body of the Sphinx enclosure in which it sits, has classic rain erosion, precipitation-induced erosion. You can call it what you like. We know that the Sahara Desert, and the Sphinx sits on the edge of the Sahara Desert, is a relatively recent desert geologically. It only goes back less than 5,000 years. The heavy rain-induced erosion, the rolling, undulating erosion that I've pointed out now in numerous papers and in other contexts, clearly, by my geological analysis, predates the modern Sahara. It predates about 3000 BC, plus or minus. Not only does it predate, the level of erosion, the amount of erosion, plus the subsurface weathering that Thomas DeBecke and I were able to measure seismically, all points to the conclusion, in my opinion, that the core body of the Sphinx is at least about 5,000 BC. And generally, when people ask me, well, how old do I think it is? What's my best estimate? I give a range of about 7,000 to 5,000 BC.
Thank you.
Was that too long for that one?
Okay. As the evidence indicates that the Nile rose to the base of the Giza complex, during that building, where do you think that the population of that time, which most have numbered at least the hundreds of thousands, lived and gathered their sustenance?
Oh, we're talking now the building of the Great Pyramid. We're down in the Old Kingdom times.
Okay.
I don't know.
Do you want?
Well, in the days of lush.
Well, okay. There's a couple of issues here. I mean, if we're talking about the building of the Great Pyramid and the building of the Sphinx, the Sphinx is not really built. It's carved from the bedrock limestone. But when they carved it, they cut out blocks around the body to cut out, to form the shape of the body. But they actually didn't chip it away and shove out rubble. They actually cut out large limestone blocks, multi-ton blocks, and brought them forward to the front of the Sphinx, to the east of the Sphinx, and erected what's now known as the Sphinx Temple. And the Sphinx Temple is clearly, in my analysis, the same age as the core body of the Sphinx, so that's pre-dynastic. How many people it would have taken to do that, I don't know. I've not tried to do analysis of that. We're not talking a huge amount. I mean, probably hundreds, but not necessarily even 1,000 in my assessment. So I don't think it's a huge problem as to getting a large population then. Later in the Old Kingdom times, when you're building the pyramids, the superstructure of the Great Pyramid, for instance, best estimates are you need incredible workforce. You will have to house them, you will have to feed them. And there have been found in recent years on around the edge, the periphery of the Giza Plateau, evidence of bakeries, evidence of encampments, that type of thing, for a fairly large settlement, a fairly large number of workers in Old Kingdom times. But I think we have to distinguish between what's happening in Old Kingdom times and what's happening at earlier times, what I sometimes informally call Sphinx Age times, that earlier pre-dynastic time. I don't know if I answered your question at all.
Well, we were talking about hundreds of thousands. That where did they gather
Yeah, but
their
that's
sustenance?
that's.
But you were saying
You don't need for what I'm looking at with the early structures, the pre-dynastic, the Sphinx Age
Right.
structures. I don't believe you need hundreds of thousands. I'm not even certain that you need thousands at any one time. I think you're potentially talking a smaller number. I would say in the hundreds, maybe around 1,000, just off the top of my head. When you start talking about huge numbers of people, I think what you had in Old Kingdom times was a very efficient bureaucracy that was bringing food in from other parts of Egypt. You've got the Nile right there near the Giza Plateau. Easy to ship food and supplies. We know that in Old Kingdom times, for instance, and this ties right in with the Sphinx Temple, which by my dating is much older than Old Kingdom times, was refurbished, I believe, in Old Kingdom times, in part by covering the weathered ancient limestone temple with a fresh layer of granite. Where did that granite come from? Where did that granite come from? It came from the Aswan area in Upper Egypt. So that's the far south of Egypt in modern terms. And they were apparently floating blocks of granite, multi-ton blocks of granite down the Nile from the south to the north. The Nile, of course, flows from the south to the north. And so they were quite capable of transporting supplies and materials from all of Egypt, because the Nile basically runs right through the middle of Egypt. So they could supply the Giza Plateau with anything they needed from anywhere in Egypt. Even though I think you have to distinguish a couple of things here. Back in pre-dynastic times, it was lusher and not as barren desert, so you could have more food and supplies maybe produced, I wouldn't say on site, but in more the local area. But I don't think that's an issue one way or another, because even during dynastic times, in classical Egypt with the Nile flooding and the seasonal inundation, right in the Nile Valley was an incredibly lush area for agriculture, that type of thing. And I think well into pre-dynastic times, my belief is that they were transporting things down the Nile. And even in pre-dynastic times, you could have supplies coming from effectively anywhere in Egypt that you needed.
Okay, thank you. The ancient Egyptian city-state Heraklion is now submerged in the Mediterranean 5 miles offshore in about 30 feet of water. So, do you think that it was submerged when sea level rose with the end of the Ice Age?
Well, if you said...
Yeah, well, I'll mention something. I mean, what you have is that we know there were cities along the coastline, what's now the Mediterranean coastline, at the end of the Nile Delta. The Nile, of course, travels the length of Egypt from south to north, and then actually the apex of the Nile is where modern Cairo is, basically, and then the Nile fans out and goes into the Mediterranean. And we know, even from tablets and writing of the earliest dynastic and late pre-dynastic times, that there were fortified cities, etc., in the Nile Delta, apparently at the very edge of it, what was then the Nile Delta, which is now underwater. And I mean, this is well understood that these were flooded. Even much later sites, for instance, Alexandria, modern Alexandria, which of course is a city that only goes back a little over 2,000 years, founded with the Greek invasion under Alexander the Great and the Ptolemies. But we know, for instance, very recent excavations of all kinds of, materials and palace, whatever, from Cleopatra's time, just a little over 2,000 years ago, were flooded. And so, yeah, that has something to do with maybe the rising rising levels at the end of the Ice Age, but we're really talking not even at the end of the Ice Age, but a bit later than that. Also, you can have local subsidence. I mean, as a geologist, you really have to look into all kinds of possibilities. Overall rising sea levels, local subsidence, when you got a very active delta, often, areas in a delta will start to subside if they don't get enough sediment input. A living delta, a living river is changing its course all the time, so it may starve one area for sediment versus another area at different times, and this is going to have a real effect on the land and whether it stays above water when you're talking about the edge of a delta.
Okay.
That was probably a very long-winded answer. But what was the question again?
Well,
Tying it to sea
about,
level?
do you think that it was, the Heraclean, that city submerged in the Mediterranean 5 miles offshore?
Yeah.
Do you think that it was submerged when sea level rose with the end of the Ice Age? That was the question.
What's your answer?
And I think I answered it, which is...
Yes, right? Basically.
Well, okay, let me try again. Yeah. It could have been, but there's a... we know that there were ancient cities on the edge of the Nile Delta, on the shores of the Mediterranean, basically. And the placement of the delta, how far the delta extended at various points in ancient times was different than what it is today. And some of them are now underwater in the Mediterranean, some sites, some ancient cities. And that could be due to sea level rises that we've had since the end of the Ice Age. Could also be due to localized land subsidence in certain regions. It could be due to sediment starvation as the delta changes. And these are natural geological processes. The branches of the Nile, change from one area to another. So there's a lot of factors that could be going on. And you can't just say, well, it's under so many feet of water, sea levels rose so much, extrapolate a simple rate of sea level rise and say, well, 30 feet of water equals so long ago. I mean, that is overly simplistic and naive. One thing that's been suggested by some people is that different levels of acidity in natural rainfall will affect how fast limestone is eroded by that rainfall. Okay, I want to start over. The core body of the Sphinx and the Sphinx enclosure, by my analysis, shows clear erosion by rainfall. It's limestones, rains being down on it, eroded the rock away. It gives the form that we see because of rainfall, not because of desert conditions in the last approximately 5,000 years. Now, one thing to try to figure out is how long did it take to get the level of erosion that we see. And something that's sometimes suggested is, well, because of increased volcanic activity, other factors like that, in very ancient times, pre-dynastic times, maybe average levels of acidity in the rainfall, basically natural acid rain, would have eroded the limestone faster. That means by looking at how much erosion you have to sort of take a higher rate of erosion into account. That would make it a bit younger rather than older. So one has to look at all those types of factors. And in fact, I have tried to take that into account in my analysis, and I admit that my quantification is, very crude approximation. One thing I would point out, though, is that I'm not just looking at how much erosion we have on the surface and how deep that erosion is, but more importantly, in my analysis, and this tends to be overlooked by a lot of people, is that Tom DeBecke and I did seismic work, subsurface work around the Sphinx, and there we were able to look at weathering, not erosion because the rock is still there, but mineralogical changes that increase with depth. once the rock is exposed. So you expose the rock around the Sphinx when the body was carved out. You expose the rock around the Sphinx when the body was carved out, and then you start having mineralogical changes that work them way down over time. That is much less to basically not affected by the acidity of the rain per se. So I think that's something that we can look at, take that into account. So really, I don't think that I have to do a significant revision of my analysis just because someone suggests that at certain times in the past there was more volcanic activity and the rain might have been a little bit more acidic. And what we actually find geologically in many cases is that a volcano goes off, sulfates, aerosols, different things get into the atmosphere, then the rain is much more acidic, but for a very short period of time. When you're looking at several feet of erosion of limestone, little incidences like that are not going to have a big effect on the overall picture. In fact, they'll be fairly trivial.
Thank you.
I'm afraid these answers are too long, but
that was great.
You can cut them down.
With the maintenance by heavy rainfall of the vast network of lakes and streams during the Ice Age,
with the maintenance?
With the maintenance by heavy rainfall.
Oh, okay.
Of the vast network of lakes and streams during the Ice Age in now parched Sahara, would not that heavy rainfall have also affected the early phases of the civilization?
I'm trying to figure out how to answer this. Now, let me think about it for a second. I know what you're saying, basically. Okay, let me try this. Are you talking Ice Age or end of the Ice Age? Since what we have, the Sahara has not always been a Sahara. The Sahara was once, in very recent times, geologically speaking, was non-desert. You had a much more lush savanna type region. You had lakes, ephemeral lakes, you had rivers. We know this from a variety of data now, including imaging from satellites where you can pick up ancient riverbeds, etc. So you have times in the past when it was less desert-like. If you go back in time, you actually have sort of I won't call it a cycle per se, but you have periods of more aridity, less aridity, so more rain, less rain, etc. And you cycle in a crude sense back and forth, changing climatic conditions. I believe that it makes sense that when you had less aridity, more water, more vegetation, that may have helped promote ancient cultures. And so, for instance, we have real examples, Naphtha Playa down in southern Egypt, where it's essentially a playa as an ephemeral lake that dries up periodically. And we know, or we can correlate that when there was more water in that lake, there were more people living in the area, congregating. In fact, they were erecting megalithic structures, relatively crude by modern standards or later standards. But yeah, when you have water, you tend to be able to support more people, you tend to be able to support a culture. When I come up with about 5,000 plus years for the core body of the Sphinx, my dating of the Sphinx, I'm not using rainfall amounts or averages or trying to figure out how much rainfall it would take per year to erode the limestone so much. And what you have to remember in Egypt is that for the last several thousand years, in the height of classical Egypt, especially New Kingdom Egypt, you had incredibly low rainfall. But that didn't mean you didn't have water, because you have the Nile. As they say, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. And the Nile would go through its annual flooding cycle. And this has to do with rainfall patterns well south of what we now think of as Egypt. In the upper regions, the source of the Nile, as it's called. So really, rainfall in Egypt is not the issue per se, but water and water flow through it. But getting back to the Sphinx, the Great Sphinx, my analysis and my crude estimate, and I admit it's a crude estimate, but it's the best I can do right now, and I'm not making any other claims for it, about 5,000 to 7,000 BC. I'm not basing that on figuring or estimating there were so many inches of rain per year and that over so many thousands of years would cause the Sphinx to erode so much. What I was really looking at is, when do we have a time period with the climatic conditions that would be conducive to that type of erosion, and then looking at the subsurface weathering data. Becky and I were able to find that seismically with seismic techniques, and we could look at some areas that were dated to Old Kingdom times. How much subsurface weathering has there been since Old Kingdom times, about 2500 BC? Then for the older portions of the Sphinx, how much subsurface weathering do we have there? So we're using the known to calibrate and then find the unknown. And that's independent of rainfall amounts annually. Okay, something that we have in civilization in general, in my opinion, is we have periods of, should we say, rise and declines of civilization, rise and decline of civilization. And we see this throughout the world, whatever civilizations we're looking at. And I actually think that there's a correlation between different civilizations around the world. And I talk about that in my book, Voyages of the Pyramid Builders. So, for instance, in Egypt, we have various periods in ancient Egyptian history when essentially, in hindsight, we can talk about heights being reached and then declines after that. So, for instance, we have one height, if we could use that term, reached in Old Kingdom times in about 2500 BC, and then we have a decline over the next 500 years and these are terms that are applied by moderns as the Old Kingdom declines and comes to an end. And of course, the Old Kingdom Egyptians didn't think of themselves as Old Kingdom Egyptians. They didn't even think in terms of the dynasties that we use. So this is something in hindsight. But you definitely see the rise and fall. Then later, for instance, you have another rise and you have another height reached in New Kingdom times, and then New Kingdom times ending. If we talk about Old Kingdom height and decline, I think that might correlate to a certain extent with climate changes, and certainly there's a increasing aridity throughout Old Kingdom times, and it becomes very dry toward the end of what we consider Old Kingdom times. Not that it wasn't dry all along, because even in early Old Kingdom times you do have the Sahara developed and really setting in, but it dries out further toward the end. But something that I think is working in conjunction with this, may even be one of the driving factors, is that toward the end of Old Kingdom times, about 2345, 2350 BC, I think there's a lot of evidence for some kind of cometary effect, some kind of comets in the sky. In fact, there's even evidence that they may have had fragments hitting on the surface of the Earth. We have craters known in Iraq. And this would have affected climate also by putting aerosols and particles into the atmosphere, and had many effects. And in fact, at that time, we see not just in Egypt, but worldwide, declines in civilization. And I think one of the theses I've developed in Voyages of the Pyramid Builders, for instance, is that civilizations are very much affected by external factors, natural factors, things like climate change, things like comets entering the atmosphere and causing changes. And humans are very much tied in ancient times to the natural environment, very dependent upon the natural environment, especially for things like agriculture, crops, etc. And to this day, we're very much tied to the natural environment. So even in the modern times, when there's a major earthquake causing a tsunami, we feel it. When there's a major storm like recent Hurricane Katrina, I mean, we feel that very much. I mean, the same was true in ancient times. So all these factors, I think, are working together to affect the rise and fall of cultures and civilizations. I don't know if that was addressing it.
Yeah, it's good.
Wait, but before you get started on that, let me also ask you while we're on this climate subject.
So I mean, climate. Well, let me make this statement, so in case it's useful to you, climate and extraterrestrial influence is something that I'm very interested in. When I say extraterrestrial influence, not aliens coming down spaceships, but things like comets entering the atmosphere, meteors.
Remind me to give you a copy of my show, Comets and Asteroids.
Oh, okay. Does it confirm or deny, or is it just interest?
Well, I mean, there's several changing events.
Yeah, but I think what I think we see, and I think this is there's very clear signatures in tree rings, in ice layers that we have. From the Arctic regions, ice cores, etc., signatures at certain times, there seems to have been an extraterrestrial influence, in particular comets. And when I say comets, I use that term loosely to include comets, meteorites that may be fragments coming off of comets, etc., but entering the Earth's atmosphere, in some cases actually hitting the surface and even forming craters or exploding just above the surface, but affecting things globally, affecting climate. Of course, if something hits very close to or on the center of a civilization, that's going to have an incredible effect. Mm-hmm. But even if it's a quarter way or halfway around the world, it can have major changes on climate. So climatary factors in some cases, I think, may even be driven by extraterrestrial factors. And there's a lot of evidence that in the 24th century BC, say around 2350 BC, there was something going on that was affecting environments, affecting climates worldwide. And this is reflected in the civilizations and cultures and declines that we see. Something that a lot of people talk about is the end of the Ice Age, and when did the end of the Ice Age occur? And some people in the popular literature talk about the Ice Age ending at a certain time. All of a sudden it seems the glaciers all melt, the sea level rises, as if this all happened overnight. And as a geologist, what I see is that things happen not necessarily uniformly, but in spurts in some cases, but it's also not necessarily happening all at one time. And to talk about the end of the Ice Age, you can talk about it in different ways. If you just want to define a point as the end of the Ice Age, technically you can do that, and as we used to say in stratigraphy and geology, you drive in a golden spike. So before a certain date, it's Ice Age. After a certain date, it's not Ice Age. But if you do that, that's totally arbitrary. That's not looking at nature. And what we have in nature is that the end of the Ice Age, in a sense, is spread over a time period. It didn't just end one day. And arguably, we're still in the Ice Age. In fact, if you look at past geologic history, glaciations occurred. The glaciers got bigger. They receded again. They got smaller. They got bigger again. And we still have continental glaciers to this day in the Antarctic and Greenland. There's no reason to believe that we're actually out of the Ice Age. They're a bit smaller than they were 10,000 years ago, but they could get larger again. If you're talking about nature and what's really occurring around the world and not just drawing an arbitrary line for definitional purposes, if you're really talking about what happened on Earth, I don't think you can draw that arbitrary line. The Ice Age actually ended, if you would, in different places at different times. Not all the ice melted simultaneously everywhere. We know that there's a discrepancy between the maximum extent of the glaciers in Europe versus North America, for instance. In fact, arguably, we're still in the Ice Age. The glaciers have simply retreated to a much smaller scale than they were 10,000, 15,000 years ago. But I have no doubt as a geologist that they could well advance again, and we could go back into what everyone would call an Ice Age. We're probably, in my opinion, just in an interglacial, just between periods of major glaciation, but we still have continental glaciers. So I think it really does a disservice to simply try to draw a line and say this is when the Ice Age ended, and this is when all the sea levels rose. It was a spurts of sea level rise, but more gradual than many popular writers would make it out to be. And in fact, between about 3000 and 5000 BC, there was sea level rise, which is much later than many popular writers would want to make it out to be. And during that period, there's evidence that the sea level may have even gotten higher than it is now. And since then, it's lowered a bit again. Also, sea levels do not rise just because you add water. Water expands and contracts depending on the temperature. So when you raise the temperature, and there's evidence this is happening in the present day world due to what some people call global warming or global climate change, the temperature is increasing. All the evidence indicates, in my opinion, in this century and over the last century. But just because the water is heating up, even a very small amount in the huge ocean basins, it expands. And so it starts to lap up, and from a human perspective, sea levels rise. So there's a lot of complex factors here. And you can't just say, well, there was a huge rise in sea level 10 or 15,000 years ago. You really have to look at the evidence and when this was happening. And some of the major rises were as late as the last 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, maybe by my dating, maybe in the 3,000 to 5,000 BC range. As I talked about in Voyages of the Pyramid Builders, there were various times when sea levels were lower, sea levels were higher. This correlates in part with climatic conditions, certainly, as you capture water in ice and build up the ice caps. So, for instance, about 18,000 BC, we have a very cold period, and a lot of water is captured and stored as ice, huge continental glaciers. So accordingly, sea level was much lower, and you expose a lot of land. But that doesn't mean that everything that's underwater goes back to 18,000 BC. As in fact, sea levels have risen since then, but they didn't just all of a sudden, it's not that all of a sudden all the ice melted. In fact, there's still ice today, and sea levels just rose tremendously over a few centuries. There was a gradual increase in temperature, fluctuations in temperature, the ice melting, sea levels rising. In fact, got very warm, even warmer potentially than today, around 3000 BC, when we had higher sea levels even than now. And since then, sea levels, there's evidence to indicate sea levels have gone down a little bit. So we're really talking a huge expanse of time, about by human standards, 15,000 years from, say, 3000 BC to 18,000 BC, when you had overall trend of increasing seas, sea level, overall increasing sea level. But this is occurring in spurts, and a good chunk of it that would have affected human civilizations occurred at the very end of that time period. So you could have, for instance, a city or a culture that's now underwater, totally submerged, but it may date back to 4,000, 5,000 BC. You don't need to postulate that it goes all the way back to 10,000 or 15,000 or 20,000 BC, as some popular writers have suggested. As I discussed in Pyramid Quest, based on what's encoded apparently in the Great Pyramid, the ancient Egyptians had an incredible knowledge of the size and shape of the entire globe. Incredibly sophisticated geographic knowledge. So, for instance, and I didn't believe this when I first started researching the Great Pyramid, but it turns out to be correct. The length of the perimeter of the base of the Great Pyramid encodes the dimensions. It, in fact, is equal to 1/2 of a minute of latitude at the equator. And based on what's encoded into the Great Pyramid, the ancient Egyptians knew within 30 millimeters, or just over an inch, the length of 1 degree of latitude at the equator. Did I get that right?
Yeah,
Yes,
perfect.
perfect.
Okay. And I said half minute of degree of latitude is the perimeter, and then it's within 30 millimeters for the degree. Okay, let me continue now. Not only did they know within about 30 millimeters, or just over an inch, the degree of... Okay, not only did the ancient Egyptians know within 30 millimeters, or just over an inch, the length of 1 degree of latitude at the equator, but they also knew the polar radius of the Earth. And that's encoded in the Great Pyramid, because in fact, the Great Pyramid, if you look at it, if you think of the height of the Great Pyramid as a radius of a circle, the perimeter of the base is the circumference of the circle. So translate that into geographic terms. The perimeter of the base of the Great Pyramid represents the latitude, or the equator of the Earth, and the height represents the radius of the Earth through the poles.
Right.
Did I get that right?
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
What is the common response of conventional Egyptologists to the notion that the dimensions of the Great Pyramid were derived from precession measurements and the resultant knowledge of the Earth's diameter and circumference lengths?
They were going back to precession again.
Yeah, that has nothing to do with precession.
Okay, so forget the precession.
So forget precession, but
Okay, and I think I may have just answered, or maybe I didn't
Well,
say
what's
what
the common-
Egyptologists.
what's
Okay, wait, but before we get to that, I need to say 2 other things about the Great Pyramid, which tie right into here.
okay.
Up until the Great Pyramid, not only encodes sophisticated geographic knowledge as to the dimensions of the Earth, but it's also aligned with incredible accuracy to the true North Pole of the Earth. Not just a magnetic pole, not just approximately the North Pole, but incredible accuracy to true North Pole. In fact, it's the most accurately aligned building ever constructed before the 19th century. And it's much better aligned to this day than many modern buildings that are ostensibly aligned to a north, south, east, west set of axes. The Great Pyramid is off from true north by about 1/20th of a degree, which is an incredibly small amount for such a huge structure. It's an incredibly small amount for any structure. And one might even suggest that maybe it wasn't even off by 1/20th of a degree when it was initially built. Maybe the North Pole, or the position of the North Pole, has actually changed a little bit since relative to the site of the Great Pyramid and when it was built. So maybe they got dead on. But even if they didn't get dead on, to be within 1/20th of a degree, I mean, that shows a level of sophistication and engineering that's just mind-boggling. I don't know if that was...
Yeah, now what about like this whole thing, I think they were mentioning like pi was in the Great Pyramid.
Yeah, actually I just said that, but I didn't use the term
Didn't
pi.
use- Didn't use the
Okay.
term pi. That
Okay,
was
but
with the
you did,
apex.
you...
Yeah.
did,
Okay,
you
about, let me say with pi so you have it. But what I just said, did that, I don't know.
Well,
Let me
you
try a
did.
short version of that. Okay, wait, I'm just get some things and you can use what you want.
Honey, please.
Okay, the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid is this incredible structure, and it is aligned with incredible accuracy. It is aligned to north-south, east-west axis. And the degree of accuracy is that by modern measurements, it's off only by approximately 1/20th of a degree to perfect alignment with the North Pole. And then we have to ask, maybe it wasn't even off by 1/20th of a degree when it was built. Maybe something has changed. Maybe the pole has changed slightly, or the tectonic plate has changed slightly that the Great Pyramid is on. Doesn't matter. Even if it was off by a 20th degree when it was first built, that's more accurate than anyone could align an architectural structure until the 19th century. They were doing something that no one could replicate for thousands of years. Yeah, I don't know if that...
You were going to mention something about pi.
I'm going to... That's separate. I'm going to do that.
That's
Okay.
very interesting.
Also, the Great Pyramid, and maybe this is coincidence, maybe it's not, is very, very close to 30 degrees north latitude. And many people have suggested that, in fact, they were aiming to build it at 30 degrees north latitude. And it's off by a very small amount. And that may have simply been due to the way they sighted and figured out where 30 degrees is. Things like atmospheric refraction that would have thrown them just very, very slightly. Or simply that exactly at 30 degrees north latitude, the rock, the subsurface, is not appropriate for building a Great Pyramid. So maybe they got as close as they could to it. But this is another piece of evidence that they knew what they were doing. They understood geography. They had a good concept of geographic knowledge. Pi. Pi is definitely encoded within the Great Pyramid. And what we see is that if you take the height of the Great Pyramid from the center of the base to the apex, consider that R, radius of a circle. Take the perimeter of the base of the Great Pyramid, consider that C. Everyone knows the formula from grade school, 2 pi r equals circumference. The base of the Great Pyramid is the circumference. The height of the Great Pyramid is r. 2 times the height times pi equals the perimeter of the base. Clearly, pi is included within the Great Pyramid.
Okay. Bill?
I got that right,
Great.
right?
I think that's great.
Oh, and then did you want to include, while you're on the dimensions and the lineups, how the thing was actually lined up to the ancient prime meridian?
No, because I mean
It's a whole
that's
different thing.
people argue about that, and I mean
Greenwich,
there's
you know,
some.
because what is Greenwich? Was
What?
it Greenwich? Was it this? Was it that? What was it?
Well, okay. Well, let me make one quick comment along those lines, and
Yeah, bring
we'll
it
see
up
if
about
it.
Greenwich.
This is what he was
you know,
talking
Yeah.
the prime meridian.
Yeah.
Circumference.
Okay.
Because
Let me.
Because what is a prime meridian?
Yeah. I mean, it's an arbitrary thing.
Right.
Later on.
Okay. Wait. Let me make a quick comment. Okay. The Great Pyramid is the Great Pyramid is located at a point on the surface of the earth that many people have suggested is quite significant, highly significant. It's at approximately 30 degrees north latitude, and there is textual evidence from ancient times that in some ways the longitude of the Great Pyramid was used as an equivalent of a prime meridian in modern days. Everyone knows that the prime meridian today is designated as going through Greenwich, England, so that's 0 degrees longitude, and then we measure longitude east and west of that. And longitude, unlike latitude, there's no natural starting point for longitude. Latitude, you have the equator that's naturally defined, and then you have north latitude, south latitude from the equator, 0. But you have to have an arbitrary place to start longitude. Modern times, Greenwich, there is evidence that in ancient times, the longitude of the Great Pyramid might have been used, at least in some systems, as the starting point. One of the themes I develop in my book, Voyages of the Pyramid Builders, is that there is a lot of evidence for intercontinental connections in ancient times, that there was transportation across the oceans, that people were navigating the oceans in ancient times, and in a word, they were getting around the globe, and there was contact, there were voyages. Some of this may have been sporadic, some of it may have been more willful. Sporadic, what I mean by that is that people may have simply been blown off of course and ended up in new places where they hadn't intended to go. Other cases, willfully traveling now to new areas, but they were clearly traversing the Pacific Ocean, they were clearly traversing the Atlantic Ocean, and even though this has not quite made it into the popular realm or the general accepted, if I could use that term, academic realm, there's a lot of evidence for connections and travel and seafaring in ancient times. And this is being more and more accepted by academia and classical archaeology. And if they were doing this, I have no doubt that they were recording, they were remembering where they were traveling, they were developing a more and more detailed knowledge of the geographic base of the earth. And we know by analogy with modern peoples, quote, primitive peoples that are not so primitive, for instance, like the Micronesians, that they know where islands are, they can traverse the open oceans, they have incredible geographic knowledge of their area, which covers, of course, thousands of square miles of ocean, and they can navigate it with what seem to us like very, very primitive tools, or essentially no tools at all, observing the skies, observing the stars, observing the ocean currents. And I think this is a tradition, in many cases unwritten, not well recorded tradition that goes back into very ancient times. And I would make the point that not well recorded in some cases, because certain people that may have been traveling around the globe, they didn't want to record that. They didn't want to publicize that. It essentially was trade secrets, if you would. You know, if they were involved in commerce, and we see this in later ancient times, that you don't necessarily want people to have that knowledge, because that knowledge of detailed geography could be incredibly useful for purposes of economics, for purposes of war, of safety. So there's a lot of things going on here. Something that's very interesting and has come to the popular forefront recently, when I say recently, last 10 to 15 years, is people looking at megalithic sites, but not just any megalithic sites, but in particular megalithic sites that are now found underwater. And what we know is that, of course, since the end of the last ice age, sea levels have risen. They've risen dramatically over that time period. Over many thousands of years, they rose 300 to 400 feet, depending on where you are in the world. And quite logically, many ancient peoples lived near the coastline. And when you have that much water rising, in some cases, their cities, their habitations were totally inundated. They're now found underwater, if they're found at all. So very exciting development is the search for these ancient megalithic ruins, ancient sites underwater. But there's a lot of potential problems and mishaps also. One is identifying genuine ancient sites versus natural features that can be misinterpreted as ancient sites. So in some cases, in my opinion, there are sites that underwater that have been claimed to be ancient sites, ancient pyramids underwater, buildings, cities underwater, that I think, until we have more evidence, can be explained simply as interesting geological structures, but natural geological structures. So distinguishing the real human-built sites that have now been flooded in underwater from natural sites that superficially look like ancient human sites is one problem. A second problem with trying to study these ancient megalithic sites that are now submerged is, in some cases, so-called experts or popular authors have assumed that if you got a structure underwater, you can just look at how deep the water is, somehow correlate depth of water and with how fast waters have risen. And in some cases I've seen, people assume if it's under so much water, it must date back, say, 10,000 years or more. And that's not a good assumption. So in some cases, I believe people have interpreted natural sites as artificial sites, and then they've further gone and said, not only is it an artificial site, which I don't think is true, but because it's underwater, it must go back, say, 10,000 years or more. And they are all of a sudden have, in my opinion, fabricated from an incredibly interesting natural structure that happens to be underwater. They've turned it into an ancient lost city that must go back to some incredibly remote period of time. And from that, they then conclude that ancient people were incredibly advanced at that incredibly remote time. This must be a lost civilization. In some cases they claim, well, this must be evidence of Atlantis. And they just spin these tales and these stories that ultimately, in my opinion, when you look at their very foundation, what they're really based on, they just don't hold up at all. Let's look at a couple of examples of submerged cities or submerged structures. Off of Malta, there are megalithic ruins. In this case, although I admit I've not explored the site firsthand, but from the documentation I've seen, the photographs and other analysis, it looks to me like this is a genuine ancient site. Megalithic structures built from quarried blocks that were assembled. Clearly they weren't doing this underwater originally, and with subsequent sea level rises, the site was inundated. So I think in that case, from the evidence I've seen, we've got a genuine ancient site. On the other hand, off of the little Japanese island of Yonaguni is a structure that many people have claimed as an ancient step pyramid or some kind of ancient platform, some kind of ancient structure. I've had the opportunity to dive that site myself several times, made a number of dives there. I went there hoping against hope that it would in fact be an ancient structure submerged underwater from a very early time period. My conclusion as a geologist is that it can be explained by natural processes, that what you have there is not quarried blocks that have been assembled into buildings or other structures, but you've got natural bedrock that fractures and cleaves along very regular planes, and there's incredibly strong erosive wind and wave action, typhoons, very strong currents. In that locality, you've got many natural features coming together between the nature of the rocks and nature of the currents and nature of the weathering patterns to create a situation where the rock is naturally spalling out, being pulled out, and is forming what superficially look like very regular step-type structures. But even when I look at it, and I've dived it numerous times, look at it closely, you don't get the regularity at the ground level or underwater level when you look at the rocks right up close that you do in dressed, surfaced, quarried rock in known artificial sites. So it's not like looking at a quarry. Very deceptive in the case of Yonaguni because the structure is totally covered with biological material sponges and that type of thing that cover the surface. So it's very hard to see the actual rock versus the biological component that's growing on it. What have been claimed is perfect right angles in some cases. When you measure them, they're not so perfect. They look superficially perfect from a distance. So that's one site that some popular writers, I think, have just egregiously misinterpreted. And I might even think that in some cases people are willing, maybe it's unconscious on their part, but they're willing to misinterpret or give the benefit of a doubt to a site like that, to say it's artificial, to say it's underwater, therefore it must be incredibly ancient because it fits their bigger scheme, their paradigm that they're developing, even if it's an alternative paradigm. I feel very strongly, and I'm of the camp, some people would say, of pushing civilization back earlier. My work has been cited by many people as suggesting that civilization goes back much earlier in time than traditionally viewed, my work on the Great Sphinx in particular. So I'm open to that. But I also think that we have to look at the evidence very carefully, very critically, and we can't just use wishful thinking. I went to Yonaguni hoping that it would be what some people call the smoking gun, that this would be evidence of high civilization at a very remote time. I was disappointed and at many levels that I had to conclude it's primarily a natural feature. When I say primarily, yes, there's evidence of ancient habitation on Yonaguni Island. Yes, there's evidence that the people may have, I'll put it this way, been admiring the natural features. They may have even carved some of their tombs, which are clearly artificial, in imitation, if you would, of the natural features. But the main structure is, in my opinion, explained primarily to totally by the workings of nature. It's not an artificial structure. And that's not what, on one hand, I want it to find, but I'm not going to manipulate the data or make excuses and try to turn it into something it's not, just to fit a nice theory that I think, would be interesting.
Okay, can you mention anything about India?
I don't know if that word was that something useful?
I mean, because you talked about Malta being.
Yeah. Okay, India. There's the sites off of India. I don't know. Did you get usable stuff off that?
Yeah.
A number of ancient cities, actually several sites off of the coast of India in different parts of India, have been claimed as underwater cities, underwater ancient structures. I have not visited those sites firsthand. I've seen very little on them. What I've seen, in my mind so far, is not definitive. Especially after my experience with Yonaguni, where I went to Yonaguni having seen underwater photographs of what looked like very regular features, step-like structures, etc., that sure looked superficially like they could have been man-made. Then to go there, to have the ability to dive it, to study it closely, and find that here was nature essentially fooling us. I have to be very skeptical about some of the claims for ancient cities that are now submerged off of the coast of modern India. I'm not saying that they aren't ancient cities. I'm not saying there aren't ancient structures underwater, because it's very logical that there could be. But logical that there could be versus that they absolutely are two different things. Until I see really good evidence, artifacts being brought up, clear, definitive photographs versus just hearsay that other people saw it, that with recent tsunamis, the water was pulled out temporarily and people saw it, and then the water came back and submerged again. If someone got really good photographs that were definitive, I haven't seen them yet. So I'm going to, at this point, remain skeptical, open to the possibility, but I can't say definitively. And the photographs I have seen, I don't think are definitive in my opinion. During the last ice age, there was definitely snow, there was definitely ice, there was definitely cold temperatures. It's called the ice age, so that's what you expect. Problem is, in some people's minds, that's what they expect, that's what they think there is, and they think that's all there was. In fact, during the last ice age, what geologists refer to as the Pleistocene, from about, very crudely, about maybe 2 million years ago to, depending on how you want to date it, 10,000, 12,000 years ago. That time period, what you had were glaciations in what we call interglacials, so the ice from the North Pole coming down to lower latitudes, then receding again, coming back, receding. But it was not a case where the whole Earth was covered with ice. Some people have that misconception that everything was cold and dreary. In fact, during the Ice Age, you simply had change of where the climatic zones were from a modern perspective. You still had temperate regions. You still had an equatorial region that was quite warm. In fact, what you get in some cases is instead of change in temperature so much, you will have changes in precipitation, for instance. But it's certainly a incorrect notion, although some people have an incorrect notion that the entire world was somehow covered with ice or under winter conditions during the last ice age. Even at the height of the most extreme glaciation, there were temperate regions, there were even what we would call equatorial regions. And there were very good places for humans to live. In fact, we know humans made it through numerous glacial periods. Some humans were clearly living on the edges of the glaciers and knew how to cope in that environment. We think of the Neanderthals, a species that seems to have developed a culture that was well adapted to glacial times. But there were other people living in Africa, for instance, that weren't experiencing what we would call a glacial climate by any means. They were living in what we might call lush, temperate environment. Something that I discuss in my book Voyages of the Pyramid Builders is that I believe, and the reason I call the book Voyages of the Pyramid Builders is that I use the theme of pyramids, and we see pyramids around the globe in ancient times and pre-Columbian times in the New World. And I believe that pyramids are the indicator in that sense of a broader picture. And that picture is what is sometimes referred to as diffusionism. And among academics, there are a couple of schools of thought on ancient cultures and their interconnections around the globe. The classical, traditional view is that ancient cultures were essentially isolated from each other, at least the old world versus the new world. And I remember when I was studying as an undergraduate, the assumption, sometimes explicit, sometimes not so explicit, was that the cultures in the new world, the high civilizations of the New World, for instance, the Mayans, the Inca, the Aztec, etc., the Olmecs, they arose separately and independently in terms of civilization from the civilizations of the Old World. So you have Mayan and Olmec pyramids, remarkably similar to pyramids that you find in the Old World, but that was just coincidence. That was independent invention in the New World versus the Old World. And this was the dogma, and this makes logical sense if your assumption is that oceans are barriers, that to ancient peoples, oceans were absolute barriers. You couldn't cross the oceans. And when you've got a tradition of archaeologists working for 100, 200 years, and those archaeologists tend to be working on land. They're not sailors. Very few sailors would then turn to archaeology. They don't know the oceans. They have, I believe, a built-in bias that oceans are barriers. And archaeologists traditionally, working within a continent, working within a geographic area, if they saw a number of similarities between two cultures, their immediate conclusion would be, well, there must be trade between the cultures. There must have been contact between their cultures. There must have been cross-fertilization between the cultures. And that was all fine and dandy if the cultures were linked by land in the same continent, in the same geographic region. But when they saw just as many similarities between cultures on different sides of an ocean, be it the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, then they would invoke independent invention. It must be that they arose independently, they just hit upon the same things. You even got concepts of, I'll use the term collective consciousness or archetypes in the human psyche, that humans, no matter where they are, they'll come up with some of the same mythologies, with some of the same rituals, so because it's somehow almost ingrained or literally ingrained into our human nature. Any explanation other than that, those cultures might have actually had contact. And I think the more we look at, we see remarkable similarities among cultures, even if they're separated by oceans. And I think the logical conclusion is, well, don't try to hypothesize all these other complex explanations. They simply had contact with each other. Furthermore, you start looking at ancient cultures, and they could navigate large water bodies. They could navigate the oceans. In fact, we know from late ancient times, Greco-Roman times, Phoenician times, they were navigating the Mediterranean. They were crossing from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. A lot of people don't realize it, but it isn't that much more distant to go from Europe to the closest part of the New World, or from Africa, I should say, from the Old World to the New World. If you actually measure the distance, that's not much different than going from one of the Mediterranean to another. And we know that there were major traditions of shipbuilding. You had reed boats, and a reed boats, Heyerdahl, for instance, the great explorer, he demonstrated by doing it that a reed boat can cross the Atlantic. He demonstrated that in the Pacific you have a tradition of raft building, not little rickety rafts, but huge, we call them rafts, but they're really huge boats, huge ships even, but not built on the European tradition. Using a very different tradition, those were absolutely seaworthy. You can cross, he demonstrated, you can cross an ocean, you can cross the Pacific with those. So we know they had the technology. We know we can experimentally show that this technology could be used. We have evidence of interconnections and remarkable similarities. And more people are, I believe, coming to the conclusion, although it's still a minority, that there was major cultural contact around the globe in ancient times. So getting back to the pyramids, I don't think it's coincidence that you see remarkable similarities between Old World pyramids and New World pyramids. And I think there was actually cross-fertilization. So the Mayan pyramids, I think, have a direct connection to Old World pyramids. Olmec pyramids have a direct connection to Old World pyramids in the sense of one culture influencing the other.